You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 381 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm talking about the new Top Gun movie. North Korea has tested 2 short-range ballistic missiles, and I'll talk about what this means for potential peace. And 2 U.S. soldiers have been killed in Afghanistan. Talking about some of the most important issues on this show, so make sure you're taking the time to go on social media or recommending to friends and just getting the content out there. You do that by finding the show at the Libertarian Institute, where my show and the daily news roundup that I write are featured on the right-hand column of the homepage at libertarianinstitute.org. Once you've listened to a few shows and you know you like it, make sure you subscribe to the show somewhere. There's feeds all over the place. There's a Libertarian Institute feed that will give you my show, Free Man Beyond the Wall, the Scott Horton Show, and Liberty Weekly. And then there's just foreign policy focused streams. Either way, find it, rating and review. All that really helps the show. And last, if you want to become a donor, get in on the monthly live streams. The last live stream ran as Friday's show. Steve Waskow, who is not only a supporter of the show, but also just a great foreign policy mind who is on the blog at the Libertarian Institute, joined me and we talked about Russiagate, Iran, North Korea. So you could get on that and ask questions by becoming a patron at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. All right, so first up on today's show, I read this story, I believe at War is Born, and I'll link to it in the show notes page. But apparently Paramount Pictures has signed a contract with the Department of Defense about the new Top Gun movie. Paramount Pictures is going to get the ability to stick some cameras on planes. I guess, have Navy pilots or Air Force pilots or whoever this is, go out there and fly around and do all kinds of stunts and tricks for their cameras and have access to one of the aircraft carriers. Now, the article didn't get into if Paramount has to pay back and at what rates the Pentagon. Let's say, if you do take up 2 hours of a pilot's time and all the fuel and maintenance that needs to go in the airplane, then that might be a pretty hefty ticket when you're talking about some of these more advanced aircrafts like the F-22, the F-16, the F-35. So that, that's interesting. I would imagine that they have to send Paramount some kind of bill for that, or else it seems like, they could really privilege one filmmaker over the other. But what I'm most concerned about is what the Department of Defense got in exchange from Paramount, including being able to look over the script and add in some, sayings and slogans and stuff like that. And so basically this is going to be a government recruitment and propaganda film. And yeah, it's going to be, kind of portrayed to the public as just a Hollywood movie made to, I guess, reflect the coolness of being a fighter pilot. Now, I will say I've actually never seen the first Top Gun movie and really don't have any interest in it. Not particularly a fan of Tom Cruise. I probably won't watch this next movie either. And, certainly this story I read doesn't incentivize me to go and check it out. But I do think these kind of things are a real problem. And it's just another way the government is able to propagandize the public, especially about these war issues, where if they make war look cool and make it look like America is always in the right. And even though, war might be a little bit messy, at the end of the day, most of the Americans get out alive, they accomplish their objective, and they do a little bit of good in the world. Well, in reality, what often happens is that Americans end up dying, and what they die for isn't necessarily a good cause and doesn't better the world. It doesn't better the people in the countries that we're bombing. It makes Americans less safe, and nothing else, just by killing innocent civilians or radicalizing people in other countries. It's making us all poor. And it seems to me the more these wars we get involved in, just the more the Pentagon kind of sucks in as far as power goes. And, we see this by increasingly bigger and bigger National Defense Authorization Acts. And that's, I guess, where I'm transitioning now. So the NDAA is the baseline Pentagon funding bill, and it always includes some other stuff. And I'll get into some of that other stuff here. But in the past, this has been the 2012 NDAA that led Barack Obama into, and now Donald Trump, indefinitely detain American citizens for no crime at all. However, just because this is the main pot of money that the Pentagon gets, there's also things like the overseas war fund that, I think is now over $100 billion. This doesn't include the VA. This doesn't include the Department of Homeland Security. And then there's a entirely separate department for like Customs and Border Patrol actually defending the border. So it really just goes to show that the Defense Department is, the department are the Ministry of War. So a different version has passed the House and the Senate. The House version, $733 billion in this bill. However, there are some good things that have been passed in this bill. Repeals of the 2001 authorization for use of military force, the 2002 authorization for use of military force. The big one is the 2001 AUMF. This one has been used for war in 7-8 countries now. Military operations in dozens of countries. The excuse for so many drone strikes that have killed so many innocent people, all the way from, Libya to Pakistan. It's a crazy amount of territory. It's a crazy policy, and it's gone on for so long, in part because of the war hysteria after 9/11 and them signing onto legislation that says we could go after the people who did 9/11. And that's been translated to, attacking groups like Al-Shabaab that was formed well after 9/11. The 2002 AUMF is, of course, the war in Iraq, and I believe the Obama administration also used this to justify some of the campaign against the Islamic State. They've also at least tried to put amendments into this bill that would require Donald Trump to go to the Congress first before declaring war or starting a war with Iran. So all these, different kind of amendments are great. And even if it's going to cost $733 billion, anytime the Congress is, constraining the president, that's probably an overweighing positive on the waste. The Senate version of the bill is much worse. It's $750 billion, so even more government waste there. And it doesn't include any of the good things. So now they're going to get together at conference here. And unless the Democratic leadership puts on a lot of pressure at conference, my guess is that the bill that comes out looks a lot more like the Senate bill than the House bill. Now, that's not to say that's what's going to happen. And there's a great recent episode of the Scott Horton show that I'll link to in the show notes page where he has a guest on. And I'm very sorry, I forget the guy's name, to talk about all this. But apparently there is a lot of kind of grassroots movement right now among some activists, Democratic activists, trying to put pressure on people like Nancy Pelosi to say, hey, these amendments need to be in the final bill. And so a final bill will come out. The House and the Senate will then vote on it again. And I'll probably be talking about on the show, hey, they ripped all the good stuff out of this bill. You got to call your congressman and say no to it. Or, hey, a lot of what the Democrats have here went through it. And so, maybe it's time to end the 2001 AUMF, even if it's with a large spending bill. Donald Trump has announced that as Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coats will leave office on August 15th. I'm going to link to an article in the show notes page by John Kiriakou, where he basically talks about how, hey, Dan Coats wasn't the worst, but this guy is pretty terrible, and here are all the reasons why. The U.S. has now come to some kind of, quote-unquote agreement with Guatemala about immigration. I guess of the three countries in the Northern Triangle there, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, most of the migrants end up having to travel through Guatemala before getting onto Mexico and then the United States. So I guess geographically, the Trump administration is looking to put pressure on Guatemala to either send back and not allow as many people through their countries, or to start kind of absorbing some of the people into Guatemala. I don't know enough about immigration policy to say if people remaining in Guatemala is a good or a bad thing. Rights groups are looking to sue the Trump administration over this, saying that Guatemala isn't a safe place for these people to stay. Kind of seems to me that's probably the case. I think what the Trump administration has been looking for is, this international kind of law language of finding a safe third country, and everybody else, in kind of Latin America, Central America, denying that they're a safe third country, and the United States is. So we end up, I guess by the letter of international law with a lot of asylum seekers. And the Trump administration is to try to get Mexico, Guatemala, etc. signed on to becoming a safe third country, because then the asylum seekers, I guess, would have to stay there. Some members of the Trump administration are saying that they're interpreting, now that this agreement with Guatemala is in place, that people do have to seek either visas or some kind of migration documentation in Guatemala before coming to the United States, or the United States would just send them back to Guatemala. I'm not actually sure if that's true or if it would in any way play out that way or will impact how the migration scheme is currently going. The U.S. has put additional sanctions on Venezuela, this time targeting a Colombian businessman with ties to the president there, Maduro's stepson. What the U.S. alleges is there's like this great conspiracy to basically funnel money to the Maduro family and to this Colombian businessman through a food subsidies program. I guess they're saying that they're paying this guy for more food than he's actually delivering. I'm hoping that in the coming weeks, somebody does some time to document, what is actually going on here, how much corruption is involved. I mean, I'm sure that, this is a government run program in a socialist state. So, people are skimming money and, making, money off the people all over the place. I absolutely don't doubt that. But it may be that at the end of the day, this food service program that's probably going to be shut down because of these sanctions is actually important. And, even if the Venezuelan government, just like the U.S. government does, is siphoning off some money that really should be going towards the people, doing and sanctioning this food program is going to be more devastating than just letting it keep going, if that made sense. So expect more news on this in coming days. But I will say that I just want to take a second here to talk about, what I thought about when I read this article, which is what U.S. government programs aren't corrupt and where are they not stealing money? And why does the U.S. government have the right to sanction Venezuela over their, corrupt social programs when all of ours are corrupt too? I mean, I guess it would at least be a little bit different. Not that I would support it, but it seems less hypocritical if, the U.S. was this great country of no corruption. But all over the place. I just read an article in The Intercept. Ryan Grimm was the author about a nuclear energy company in Ohio spending about $30 billion on campaign donations and lobbying and ending up with a bill that gives them a $1.1 billion bailout. It's absolutely insane. I don't even know if Venezuela is rich enough to have that level of corruption. I mean, I guess it says something about the wealth of Americans that so much of our money can be stolen by people. And we still have enough money not to go protest in the streets about it. All right, so North Korea tested 2 short-range ballistic missiles last week. I believe it was the South Korean Defense and Intelligence that said these were of a new design. I haven't read anything suggesting that in any way this advances their nuclear program, so these, may just be either ballistic missiles with more advanced targeting systems or bigger payloads, but it doesn't seem like maybe they're nuclear capable ballistic missiles. So you've had this really interesting thing going on between the United States and North Korea since a little bit before the Singapore summit, but, really kind of gets ingrained at the Singapore summit. And this is this long proposed idea of the freeze for freeze suggested by China, which is to cool off tensions between the United States and North Korea. The U.S. stops its war games and provocations against North Korea, and in exchange, North Korea stops testing of its nuclear program. And so nuclear program, I guess, would, be nuclear capable international continental ballistic missiles, because these are something that could deliver a nuclear warhead to the United States, but not necessarily all ballistic missiles because not all of these weapons can carry nukes. But for a long time, things were going very well between the United States and North Korea. I mean, leading up to the Hanoi summit in, early this year, there were talks of possibly signing an agreement that officially ends the Korean War. And then, of course, Bolton blew it all up at Hanoi. However, Donald Trump seems to be trying to revive things since the DMZ meeting. I want to talk a little bit about why I think North Korea decided to test these missiles. North Korea is in a position where they are right now on the receiving end of a U.S. economic war. And while the communist government there certainly doesn't help the people survive, prosper, and have food, right now they're on the receiving side of a U.S. economic blockade. We don't let them export goods to be able to import food so that, they can't sell their products to import products, how, global capitalism is supposed to work. And we block a lot of aid from going into that country. So even people feel really bad about North Koreans starving and want to bring in some kind of food to that country. We say, now you actually can't do that. It's because we have all these kinds of sanctions. Now, there are some aid programs that go on, so I don't want to say get shut down entirely. But the South Koreans have certainly had to push to, get some of these aid programs to go through, and then only do at the allowance of the United States that they're not going to bring this up at the UN. Because of the economic warfare against North Korea, for them being in this freeze for freeze holding pattern really isn't beneficial. I mean, this is what Trump would call a maximum pressure campaign. This is, the same situation of Iran, lesser extent, but still true of Venezuela as well, where doing nothing is still really harming the North Korean people. And so North Korea not only has to not ratchet tensions back up with the United States, but at the same time does have to work to some kind of solution. Now, the problem here is that North Korea needs a deal that's step by step to guarantee that they're not completely giving up their nuclear program, and then the U.S. decides to put on sanctions again in a couple of weeks. So they want a thing where, maybe they shut off a nuclear reactor and then the U.S. allows North Korea to export some textiles. Maybe they shut down or destroy some missiles, and in that case they get to import some additional food, or the U.S. provides some fuel aid or something like that. These are the kinds of things that can happen in a step-by-step scenario. However, the hawks in the Trump administration, particularly Bolton and Pompeo, seem determined to push the president to only look at a big one-shot deal that requires North Korea to take a whole bunch of steps, giving up its nuclear arsenal, shutting down all of its nuclear facilities, getting rid of all of its missiles and equipments and engine facilities, and basically everything the Kim regime, has invested in the past, so many years to develop a nuclear deterrent. Well, you have to give all that up, and then we'll relieve sanctions. Of course, maybe you'll say that, well, the North Koreans are, if they're negotiating in good faith, they'll be okay with this because, us Americans are great people and we would never go back on a deal. But that's exactly what happened with the Iranians, Saddam Hussein, Muammar Gaddafi. And so Kim have plenty of examples and wants to demand, and reasons to demand a step-by-step agreement with the United States. Now, there is a man within the U.S. government, Steve Beecham, who, since, before the Hanoi summit was saying that, hey, we think we're going to do one of these step-by-step deals, is now suggesting a freeze agreement where North Korea agrees to shut off some of its nuclear facilities and basically freeze their nuclear program. And in exchange, the U.S. will start to give sanctions relief. These are the kind of deals that can be done. This is it seems like the kind of guy in the Trump administration that wants to do it. But, oh man, you still do have that Mike Pompeo, who says, yeah, we're looking to start up working level talks with the North Koreans in the next couple of weeks. But, we expect Kim Jong-un to, follow through on his promise to destroy all of his nuclear weapons and denuclearize. So it just seems like, to me, Bolton and Pompeo are trying to slow play this because Kim has given till the end of the year, as I said, the economic warfare. He has to make moves. And so for him, I think just being on the receiving end of the economic war isn't a sustainable position. It probably also doesn't look good for him with internal politics. While he certainly is the one-man ruler of that country, internal coups happen, people. And we had to, remember that maybe Kim has to show off a little bit of a hawkish side, just like U.S. leaders do, to quell some of the, real hawks within the leadership of that country. And that could be in part the reason for these missile tests. No progress is being made, so he says, hey, we're going to carry out these missile tests. Kim has said that the U.S. has till the end of the year, and then, the North Koreans are out of this whole freeze thing. Maybe they go back to testing ICBMs or nuclear weapons after that. 2 U.S. soldiers were killed in Afghanistan today. Tragic. And it's for no reason. Just watching this, and every time I see another one roll past, it's disgusting to me that we're right now discussing a withdrawal with the Taliban. There's absolutely no reason for this fighting to be going on. And yet U.S. troops are still dying in Afghanistan. It's doing us no good. I've talked about this war so many times on the show and all of its failures and all the reasons why Americans still shouldn't be dying there. And yet you still have, people who are seriously, running for president as serious candidates saying, well, Trump would be awfully reckless to leave this thing. We can't just turn tail and run, and all these other stupid, little slogans and sayings that actually just make American soldiers die in Afghanistan. As great as it would be to be able to put together some kind of peace agreement in Afghanistan that makes sure the Taliban don't try to take Kabul after the Americans leave, maybe everybody shakes hands and agrees on federal autonomous zones in Afghanistan to allow most of the ethnic groups to be self-ruled. And that way there's no reason for conflict and fighting between them. But it seems very unlikely that that's going to be the case no matter what the Americans do. And while it is probably going to be an absolute mess when the Americans leave, and it may even get worse for a little bit while more so than it is now, we're just prolonging it. It's eventually going to happen. The Americans are eventually going to leave. They're going to have to leave, even if it's the empire that ends up bankrupt and that's the reason why we leave, or the Taliban just continue to take more and more of the country, or finally we elect a president with the, desire and the, just feeling so disgusted by this war and having American soldiers down his watch that he decides to end this thing. Then, this day is going to come where there's a mess in Afghanistan after the Americans leave. So, there's really, I think, no sense in carrying out these extensive, long negotiations with the Taliban. Just go in and say, hey, look, we know your demand is that, we leave. And so here's the deal. It's going to take us about a year to wrap everything up and get all of our equipment out of here, safely. And this way we're not leaving weapons around, and I guess allow the Afghan government to strategically withdraw from some positions that if the Americans leave would just be overrun and they would be slaughtered. So you carry out all this kind of stuff, but hey, you know what? We're gone. No more need for you to wage war against us. No more reason for Taliban to kill any more American soldiers because we're no longer fighting you. We're just in the process of leaving. It's been quite a few recent bombings in Kabul. The Islamic State has claimed credit for some, including 2 bombings in Kabul last week that killed 11. The election season is coming up again in Afghanistan. Historically, this has been a time of violence, so doesn't look good and not a good scenario when you're trying to come to peace talks, but maybe, the peace talks will help to quell the violence, not the violence, destroying and kind of just destroying, the whole peace thing. Of course, there's a bunch of bombs going off in Afghanistan all the time and the Taliban are blowing up 100 people at a funeral or something like that. Rachel Maddow is going to be all over that. How could Trump possibly leave Afghanistan when at a time like this? He's the worst commander-in-chief ever. So that's, I think, a threat coming up. The potential vice president for Afghanistan, he's actually running on the same ticket as the current Afghan president, was injured in one of these bombings that ended up killing 20 civilians. No claim of credit for that attack so far. Donald Trump apparently sent Lindsey Graham to tell Turkey that the U.S. would not sanction Turkey for buying the S-400 missile system if they didn't switch that system on. Seems unlikely to me that the Turks are just going to sit there with this nice new fancy S-400 and not turn it on and train on it. That way they know how to use it if they ever need it. This was a multi-billion-dollar weapon sale. But, you can kind of see here the Trump administration trying to find some way around having to sanction Turkey, fellow NATO ally. Turkey has threatened to go elsewhere for fighter jets. As we know, the United States has threatened to cut Turkey out of the F-35 project for Turkey buying the Russian-made S-400 air defense system. And I'm guessing that Turkey probably uses their air force more than most countries. I mean, if you look at their island disputes with Greece, and I think, Greece is constantly complaining about Turkish jets violating their airspace. They're continuing to carry out an air war in northern Afghanistan. They say they killed 34 Turkish PKK Kurds militants hanging out in Iraq last week. And then, of course, there's all the conflict on their southern border with Syria, where Turkey has, carried out some operations and airstrikes. Recently in Syria, Assad finally broke the stalemate that's not quite yet in the Idlib province. This is in the northern Hama province, but is generally part of that rebel-controlled Idlib area of Syria. These are the Al-Qaeda al-Nusra guys, and Assad's army made some progress against them today. All right, the last thing I want to mention on today's show, and that is, I've kind of been updating and keeping an eye on what was happening in Sudan. Recently, it looked like there was some progress made, some positive talks between the protest leadership and the ruling military council in Sudan. They seem to have come to some kind of complicated agreement. However, 5 protesters were killed, 4 young school children and then another adult. And this has sparked another wave of protests. And my guess is that this is going to make the current agreement, power sharing agreement between the protest leadership and the military council go out the window. And we may return to a pretty dangerous state in Sudan. All right, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org. The show is now being published at Checkpoint Asia. It's a great website. My friend Marco Marianovich, former guest on the show, runs the thing. So you definitely want to go there and get some international news. Check me out on Twitter at KYAAALE. There's a private Facebook group, Foreign Policy Focus. patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus, and I'll talk to you all next time.